it should be live.
Not yet. Oh, yeah, the live.
Wash me over gentle waters, help me follow my stream in this ocean of life. Fish coming in different species, another one of life's lessons, and at times my blessings seem few and far between. All these politics, I'm sandwiched in between. If the twins good and bad never cease to exist, my eyes are salty from the fear of swimming alone. Though heroes are born in adversity, heroes are born in adversity. My heart skips a beat. 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 For what it's worth, I thought I should write you this letter. Maybe it might make me feel a bit better than this wall of destruction you were busy constructing in my mind, while all the while I thought you were kind. And yet I feel it again, this discomfort. Could it be you that is bringing the breakdown in the showdown of the rising of this queen? With rains of infinite passion, you drown me in. Just after the lesson on how I could be a better person. My heart skips a beat. My heart skips a beat.
That was a lovely introduction. Welcome, Africa Amahle. We are in conversation with Ntsiki, Mazwai, and Azania, Tyhali. We do apologize for the network issues. I was commenting earlier that it seems like the gods are being a little bit patriarchal because at the 11th hour we were about to be succumbed by tech glitches. Nonetheless, we are here about to begin. So welcome again. Without any further ado, my name is Zukiswa White. I have the incredible honor of being a moderator in this conversation between two sisters I deeply admire at the personal level, at the political level, all of it. And I encourage you to be in conversation with me, with them, by chatting in the comments box. Once again, there will be a moderator who will make sure that the questions get to us and we are able to address them. Thank you so much. With that, Azania, I'm going to open the floor to you. Tell the Africanists out there who you are, what you're about, very briefly, and then hand over to Sister Ntsiki. And let's get this 1.5 hour on the roll.
Okay. Molweni, igama lam ndingu-Azania and Tyhali. I'm a Pan-Africanist, a student at the University of the Western Cape, an activist, a lover of Black women. That is basically it about me. I'm just another Black woman who's suffocated in South Africa. I'm another Black woman who's dispossessed, who's landless. And I'm just another Black woman who's striving to call a body her own and a soul her own. That's basically it. Thank you.
Beautiful. Hi, everybody. Gamalam Ntsiki, Mazwai. I'm an artist and an activist, and a bit disruptive. And I don't know, I'm a lot of things to different people. And I'm looking forward to this conversation because I do feel like there is a clash that is happening between what we've been taught about ourselves and our role as women in this generation. And I'm happy to be here and be a mouthpiece.
Thank you so much, beautiful daughters of the Azanian soil. So you both speak to what is at the heart of this. I think there needs to be some level of honesty also from our parts. We do know that this is a conversation that should be given a platform which is long overdue. and the patriarchy that we exist in the world, unfortunately, our movements have not been able to escape that. And by our movements, I want to be very clear that I'm speaking about movements in the Azanian left, or what we would colloquially call Black consciousness, Pan-Africanist space, right? We've long had to have a family meeting about our agenda, about the ways in which we are delaying the Azanian revolution because of our lack of prioritizing interpersonal relationships and politicizing them as what should be done, because nothing about our existence, including our relationships, was not tainted by the colonial encounter, right? In terms of contemporary struggle, my argument is that our problems begin with the colonial encounter. This is not to romanticize Africa, this idea of a pre-colonial Africa, but to say that contemporaneously, at least, we know that everything about who we are, everything about what mattered to us was completely destabilized with the usurping of our land and consequently dispossession materially, spiritually, culturally, and otherwise. So this is the heart of this conversation. We are taking our hats off to the team that has made this possible, because Africa, we need to talk. We really seriously need to talk. And this is what this conversation is going to be about. It's going to be very conversational, very interactive. So we are hoping that you are going to engage us with that. Let's talk, sisters. I'm going to ask Wena Azania to talk to me a bit about Africanism, feminism, and whether there is a contradiction. You said in your opening that you are an African woman who's essentially fight in the fight of her life to call her body her own, and as well as claim her soul as her own. And I think you do us the favor of boldly asserting that there is absolutely no contradiction between what Prof imagined as he was making that statement, that we are in a fight to call our souls our own. So we've been told that, and I know you were a leading forelist leader, that this thing of feminism is delaying the revolution, is breaking the Black family unit, and other such reactionary statements. What do you make of that, and how you understand the role of gender justice, whether it's articulated through a politic of feminism, Africanism, African feminism, Black feminism, womanism, mfazism, whatever we want to call it? What is, talk to us a little bit about that. What does African feminism or Africanism and feminism, as per the topic, mean to you?
Okay, thank you very much once again for the opportunity to actually be in conversation with this lovely African woman. And as Uzuki had uttered earlier, that there's the conversations that have been delayed and the conversations that we have been meaning to have, right? So I don't think, I think we should be grateful to the fact that we are sort of on a lockdown, which has provided many of us with an opportunity to reflect in terms of where do we see ourselves, what is it that we want to establish, and who are we as African women. So in essence, I would love first to briefly contextualize the African feminism to how I relate to it, to how I understand it. And my doing so would then be connected, of course, with movements of women and what women have been doing on the ground in terms of advocating for gender justice, in terms of advocating for gender equality, in terms of just advocating at large for women's rights, right? So my understanding of feminism is one, African feminism, is simply that, right? It is about collective desires, right? It is about a collective action, right? Which is a response to the collective patriarchy. in which we are trying to change, and which it seeks to change the political setup of the neoliberal Africa that we see today, right? It is about mobilization of sex workers. It entails the mobilization of men and women. It is also about the women in North Africa. It is about the women in West Africa who are currently advocating for issues of femicide. It is about women in South Africa who are currently, in North and West Africa who are advocating for issues of female genital mutation. And if we understand and know of the history of that is founded upon patriarchal notions, it is about women in South Africa who are actually organizing themselves against femicide. It is about women and the whole broader continent. Even though we come from culturally different societies, but it is simply all about our collective action in terms of the Africa that we envisage, the Africa that we imagine as collective and actually as Black women and African women in essence.
Sorry, Azania. Okay, to my understanding, this was going to be a conversation between the two of us, because you are the new generation, the younger generation. I think you're in your 20s. I'm about to get into my 40s. So I feel like let's talk about the things that we're growing up with and that we're facing that conflict with what we've been taught. Like, do you believe, like some of the things that we grew up with, like I kind of feel as if we were taught to look at African culture through white people's eyes. So we were told about ourselves being abused because we were cleaning. But when you get older, you realize that taking care of the home is just part of being human. And it's a part of sharing responsibilities, like how the men would go out into the fields or go look for the meat we're gonna eat that we're gonna cook. So I wanna know about that intersection, about this new generation and how you feel about that. Because I remember when I was young, I used to be very stressed about girl things, the things that girls have to do. And I want to know where younger women are right now about such issues.
Okay. Okay, so you want us to look into issues currently as a young Black woman, in terms of how then things play out in the household, in terms of in our gender roles and everything. Lovely, thank you. Basically, for Mnandingu Azania, for somebody that was brought up by a single parent, one would then expect that I come from a home that is not patriarchal. One would then expect me to come from a home that does not have gender roles. Another one would expect me, therefore, to understand largely women issues simply because I was brought up by a single woman. But in essence, that is not the case, because of my household and how I was brought up is in essence influenced by the broader society, right? Because for me to raise Azania, you find that in many instances in our culture, you'd hear that it takes a village to raise a child, right? But then what does it mean in the contemporary Africa, what are those values that are being embedded to the child, be it either a boy child, be it either a girl child, right? I also grew up in a society that, and I still believe that our experiences, Noba Una 40 and I still believe that they are sort of still the same, right? On the basis that we still are children of single mothers. South Africa still has households that are mainly ran by Omakulu.
And does that not mean then South Africa is actually matriarchal? If all the households are being run by women, does that not in its essence mean that we're actually in a matriarchal system, but dressed in patriarchy?
We are in I would not necessarily deem it as being matriarchal, because I really do not think that we have grasped or grappled with colonialism at its root, right? We have not seriously unpacked as to what then is the Africa that you previously know, or your pre-colonial Africa, and what is the current Africa, right? And I say this precisely when I ask Ntsik, because I'm trying to run away from the fact that we are saying that our households are matriarchal, but in essence, the system that which we exist in, it is white, it is supremacist, it is racist, and it is very much patriarchal, you know. And that system, it is the very system that is then the umbrella body, therefore, that constitutes our livelihood, it constitutes our who we are, it defines our existence within the society. And I say this precisely because even decisions thereof that are taken when it comes to issues in general that are speaking to issues of gender in the South Africa, you would find that even in this seminar, it is mostly men that make these policies that seek to address issues that we, us, as Bafana in this country are faced with, which then to me brings me back, okay, it triggers me to some of what I've learned, or some of the things I've been able to observe, be it both the MK, be it both the APLA forces, right? To say that these decisions that are mainly being taken by men, we are seemingly forgetting that where do these men come from? What were they doing? Where they coming from? Like, for instance, if you look in the camps, pre-independence, if we were to call that post-apartheid South Africa, you'd find that in the camps, women were raped by forces who are today in power. You would find that women were brutalized by forces today that are in power. Do we then call our society matriarchal? Do we then call our society, in that essence, right? Do we call our society matriarchal? Do we also even have hope within the governing government of our time to say that it will fully be able to address issues that us as women currently are faced with?
Azania, let me come in there and flip the question back to Sister Ntsiki with her argument that look and you know, from the following her work and you know, her activism over the years, what is your understanding, Sister Ntsiki, of that argument that South Africans live in a matriarchal society and have, in a sense, I suppose, behave in ways which are averse to how we are, like, as a person? And I'm asking this as per Azania's intervention, that ultimate feminism, African feminism for her becomes a sort of response to a collective experience of colonial violence and the neo-colonial project, right? Including colonial interpretations of our morals, of morality, as well as notions of justice. How do you relate to that? Yeah.
Got it. I think, as that, you're absolutely right that we are victims of colonialism, because when you actually look at, when you study ancient Africa and you look at the architecture and you look at the arts that come from them, you can see that women were revered and that women were considered godly. And when you think about how we used to be dressed in like beads and not, and breastless, and not have issues like rape. So it tells me that in the past, Africans revered women. But our issue is that the white man came to Africa and exercised power over the black man. And I think that the black man started taking out his frustration on the black woman. And as a result, then we're having all the gender-based stuff and the patriarchal stuff coming through. But I don't think in African essence and in African spirituality, men are above women. I think that's a very Christian teaching. Christians came and taught women that you are the neck, the woman is the head, the woman must submit. So there are all these teachings that taught women to submit, and they're all Western teachings. So I saw Sintu. It's not in our culture for women to be less than men. If anything, men revered women because they believed that since we carried the womb, that made us very, we had godly powers because we could create. So as a result, that's why I say that we are, as Africans, we come from a matriarchal lineage, and it's following through even now in this generation. When we say that we're raised by single mothers, all of us, why are we not all saying I'm raised by a single father? Because it's women who are raising the families. So we are still in we come from, in its essence, Africa is matriarchal, but we're stuck in the system that has abused our men, and in turn, our men are now abusing us. And now it's important to start having that conversation, especially with men, and pointing out these toxic things that they do, because I don't think what Abelungu said was patriarchy was patriarchy. I mean, I made the example of cooking. Let me, an example that Dr. Kanyisi Litchfield always gives in her talks is that white people came and they saw the men in the fields, and they saw, I mean, not the men, the women. They saw the women in the fields. And then they were like, look at these lazy African men making the women do the heavy work. But in fact, when you look at biology, our blood as women, our period blood, when you put it into your crops grow a lot faster and a lot bigger. So when Africans recognize that women make crops grow, that's how women ended up in the field. But then white people come with their white people eyes without knowing where it comes from or why, and the sophistication of the system. They come and they judge us, and then we go to these education, the school of education, where they're teaching us how barbaric our systems are, whereas our systems are actually very sophisticated. So I think that a very big problem of us as Africa is we've started looking at ourselves and our cultures through white people eyes.
Sure. So I'd like to throw a span in the works, right? And try to get your sister's understanding of what then is the meaning or becomes of culture in the context of an ongoing history of conquest, right? What is the role of culture? So it's good and well that we must have a strong sense of ourselves, and Litchfield Chabalala's example of why crops aren't growing in Africa and connecting it to having adopted the ways of the colonizers is a perfect example. I always, as a young Azanian woman, African feminist, deal with this thing. What is the role of this African culture? Can we actually speak of a thing in 2020 that is an African culture, considering that our cultures have completely been, bastardized because of this conquest? And also contemporarily, these men themselves have engaged us and engaged the world with the eyes of the colonizers. And a big part of it is also the holding on to anything that is close African, even if it's at the expense of the subjugation of vulnerable populations, including arguments that say that, being lesbian or gay is an un-African culture. So what do we make of that as sisters?
Lie.
Yeah, which is a lie. But what do we make of that?
I just want to clarify the LGBTI thing. It's a complete lie. In fact, in African spirituality, in ancient times, people who were gay or queer were considered spiritual healers because Black people found it to be extraordinary that you could be both man and woman at the same time. So they thought that that was God. So where it got bastardized, actually, and I even remember even growing up, you would see Black men hugging, holding hands. It used to be normal. But again, white people eyes, the men were like, ooh, you're gay. Why are you holding hands? So for us, we've never had a sexuality thing and a homophobia thing. In fact, it even comes down to the pretext, like when you got names, Ntsikelelo, no Ntsikelelo, we had to come up with the no when white people came, because they didn't understand how come a name could be for boys and for girls. Because in our culture, we don't have boys and girls. If you look at our languages, we don't have a word for he and a word for she. So to us, we were just abantu. So I think that it's a misconception to say that the LGBTI community is un-African. That's a complete lie. And if you look at our history, you'll see that that's a complete lie. I don't remember what else you asked.
I was essentially asking what becomes our intervention? What do we make sense? And the question is to Azania and you alike of the culture and the role of culture. Do we insist on a sort of back to Africa kind of rendition? Or do we insist on a position that says that, look, there is nothing African or exclusively African about the ways in which we as conquered and colonized people practice culture. Therefore, perhaps we should not make so much reliance on these notions of culture as a response to the as a response to the patriarchal men who want to advance these arguments for their patriarchy and homophobia. When we know that this is a completely bastardized notion of culture. So in simple terms, I guess I'm asking, how do we relate to culture as African women, as Africanist women? Azania, you can come in, or Sister Ntsiki.
Okay, I think for me, I'm not really fully much a person that focus in culture, right? But of course, I do look into culture, specifically to understand upon Suga corner, right? But mine is we have this tendency of painting in pre-colonial Africa as this perfect Africa, right? Where these contradictions never existed. And then currently right now where we find ourselves, it is a position where the Western notions, therefore, of what gender, of what womanhood is, of whatsoever, right, is, we've been so much fixated on this thing of Africa was a perfect setup. So for me, what then needs to happen when I was looking, I really do think that specifically when it comes to African feminism, if you look in many instances, because I specifically am interested in also of not only theorizing in this thing, because I think that is where most of the time we find ourselves, there's nothing that we're establishing on the ground. As I was trying to prepare for this work, and of course in previous layers, I've been interested, right, in understanding how other cultures, how other women in different parts of Africa respond to issues of patriarchy, right? And there is, in Kenya, for instance, you have spaces whereby they have liberated spaces where women only stay in those liberated spaces, and men and other, it's only inclusively women, and there's other spaces that they're exclusively women and other inclusive, in essence that right? And this is simply based, therefore, on the relationship in which they have had with men within their society, which is also exactly and the relationship that we have currently with Black men in South Africa, right? Because for me, the pre-colonial notion of Africa, it's this notion that it romanticizes the violence that the Black men embody. It romanticizes brutality that we experience at the hands of Black men. It also, at the same time, most Black men today, we view only feminism as though whereas men also, I think, need to be included in the feminist conversation so that they do also understand what the feminist discourse entails and what, therefore, feminism is all about, right? You look at African nationalism, because the African feminism, it is very much connected to Pan-Africanism, right? And if you look at and understand therefore what Pan-Africanism on its own entails, right? So there is that for me, there's that lake, that cross-cultural communication that happens, that needs to happen amongst ourselves first as African women, because I do believe sincerely so that before anything else, and before we discuss issues of culture, we need first to have that conversation, us as African women, to say that, as a unifier, to say what is the problem that we are facing currently today. Because also at the same time, Zuki, I don't want to dwell much, but yeah, I'm going to come back to this. Thank you. You can give to Ntsik. But mine is basically upon
I'd like to disagree with that whole notion of romanticizing ancient Africa. I think that's a very white narrative and it's the one that dismisses Isintu Setu and makes us not focus on Isintu Setu. I think that a lot of people have hung on to their own cultures and succeeded in the world. You look at the Indians, they're holding on to their culture, they're fine in the world. You look at the Chinese, they're holding on to their culture, they're fine in the world. So there's this thing that makes us want to distance ourselves from our history and our culture. If our history was so brutal, it would have been carried through. Some of the cultures would have been carried through, these traumatic cultures, just as much as different types of food we have from ancient times that have been carried through. If there was such social behaviors from ancient times that were abusive, we would be seeing them today. So I completely and utterly disagree with the fact that we romanticize Africa. I think that the further we move away from our identity, the more vulnerable we make ourselves. I think that when you enter, let's say, if there's a table, right? I feel as if Amandi are coming to the table as themselves, the Chinese are coming to the table as themselves, the white people are coming to the table as themselves, but the Black people are at the bottom of the table because they are not coming as themselves. So for me, the culture conversation is a big conversation because you find a lot of our values are hidden inside our language and our culture. And you find, let's make an example of polygamy, right? When I grew up, it was demonized and it was like, oh my God, African men are so greedy. But the older you get, you're like, man, this makes sense because nobody is going to stay with one person forever. Realistically speaking, there is no such thing. That is something that we learned from Hollywood, right? And some of us, we don't really want the man around all the time. We just want the So there are little dynamics that African culture allows ourselves to be ourselves. I mean, you hear of African villages where if a man comes to his girl's house and he finds a tie hanging on the door, she's saying, keep busy. And that's allowed in the culture. In our cultures, there's a thing where if the brother dies, then the wife can marry the other brother. There are all these little things that take care of little social ills that can happen, we think, we don't really consider why we do the things we do. So I do think that there's definitely a conversation that needs to happen, Nabantu Abadala and the youth, especially Nabantu Abadala in the villages, in our homes, to find out how do we do our Masiko Etu? How did we do it before? Because we were not getting raped before, guys. The dynamics and the things we're facing today were not happening. In the past, if your husband beat you up, the other men in the village would come and beat him up. So when you guys say that we're romanticizing, I'm like, no, we've moved away from ourselves. And that was actually when women were the safest. So yeah.
Okay. What I like. Oh, are you coming in, Aza? Okay, come.
I do get Ntsik, right? And also Chinese, Indians, and also, but also at the same time, at the back of my mind, there's something ANC guy, right? To say that if specifically to Chinese, we're speaking to people that had a cultural revolution, you know. These are people that to this day hold those values because of the cultural revolution that which they had, right? You come to us as Africans. What then is culture? How do we even hold, what is it? How do we even hold that,
We
right?
need that
Because the
revolution.
culture of South Africa, because currently the culture of South Africa is especially the general culture is a very violent one, right? It is an anti-woman culture, right? So to me, that is the culture I am referring to Ntsik, right? And also, in essence, and also going back to Emakhayeni and going back to Amasiko Wetu, I also think that we cannot negate the fact that amasiko, what Tina we deem as there are very much some patriarchal elements that declare us as nobodies as women, and men are human in that instance, right? I'll make a typical example, for instance, into Zokwaluka, right? You'd find that in the contemporary South Africa, right? And when Black mothers who brought up those children single-handedly by themselves, right? But when their children are going to the initiation school, the very same women that brought up these children single-handedly, that know they're about to be the people that they are today in society, are not even allowed to know about when they can go higher, right? Because of what? It's a male terrain, it's a male domain. But then it goes back, what happens therefore? Because Africa is matriarchal, right? But what happens for the instances, because this is the contemporary that we live in, these are experiences that we currently are experiencing. South Africa is very much homophobic, right? Even if that is not embedded within the African culture, but the current South Africa, which is a settler colony, it is very much homophobic. But either it took that from the settler colonialist, right, that occupied Azania, but the fact remains that whatever culture that the white settler colonial came with, therefore that culture has been embedded to us currently, as out in this context speak to, rightfully so, to South Africans, right? You go even Ntsik to this thing of South Africa being matriarchal, because for me, there are a lot of things I'm trying to think, and I'm trying to be what you call practical as possible, right? And take it from into how they've been happening and where we find ourselves today. Because for me, it is very important that when you hold these conversations of culture, when you hold this conversation of feminism, they not be seen as though they are conversations, therefore, that want to disturb. Because in many instances, we have been taught and we've seen in spaces, even though we're saying pre-colonial Africa was not patriarchal, but we have been in spaces, especially within political spaces, whereby when gender issues are then being raised, those things are not taken into consideration, as though we are not in a society that today is very much violent to specifically to women, is violent to the LGBTQI, even though Africa was not like that. Then how do we then come back again? How do we collect ourselves? How do we organize ourselves as African? And whatever, it can be African nationalism, it can be African feminism, but how do we respond to the contemporary issues that we are currently having, right? And we're not, because seriously, it really intrigues me that when you're saying that, but funeka consulting in this instance, but I will not therefore a generation on its own, I will not a generation that on its own has developed certain cultures, and then how do we then, as this generation, move forward in trying to create therefore a culture that is going to respond to our issues that we are currently facing?
We can't pick up a culture as doing, guys, and then be like, we are the new generation, we're creating a new culture. We need our elders. In life, there are different phases in life. There's being young, there's being middle age, there's being older. You can't dismiss the wisdom of people who have experienced life. So our elders are always going to be important in African culture, just as our youth are important in African culture. In African culture, we believe in the circle. And if you go to the village, the elders will tell you that no, because there's a relationship, a cyclical relationship that happens. And then again, amasiko ethu, they go according to each clan and each family. Yes, there are some men who have abused culture and used it to their own benefit and to oppress women. I completely agree. But if you actually go to the real essence of the thing, young boys do need to go off with men and have men speak to them and men teach them how to be men. Because us women will never be men. We will never know the male experience. So it's very important to encourage that dialogue, to make sure that the young men are speaking to the old men, just as much as it's important to encourage the conversation between young women and older women. Not we have in Donjana where the women take the girls on the side and we go through our rituals, and men are not allowed in that space because it is the space for women. So men also have a space for men. And we must just respect that as the two genders, as long as we come together in the middle, and there should obviously be some lessons on how to be in daughter for real. And then for me, I also used to be very anti-circumcision, and I was like, oh my
Sorry,
God, yeah, this is so sexist. Until my little brother.
Sorry, Ntsiki, I think when we've lost you for quite a bit, there was a little bit of a network issue. I think we lost you at the point where you were essentially saying you were also against circumcision. From that point, we lost you.
Also,
yeah.
And then my brother went into the mountains. And then that's when I found out that actually the sisters can go with them. So I went there with them. I was even inside the Ronta with them. So it does go according to each family. There were moments when I couldn't go and they had to go on their own things. But I did go in. There's a culture of the sisters coming to cook for the brother, because who else is going to cook for your brother? So I think that there are lies sometimes in all of this unpacking of African culture. That's why I'm like, we actually need to have a sit-down session, and with our families, there needs to be a congregation of clans where we sit down and we start having these conversations between us and the youngsters. How did we used to do things? Because actually, guys, it seemed to be working a bit better than it is now.
Okay, let me jump in, Ntsiki and Azania, and this is nice because there's some things happening and brewing in the comment section. On the question of where I'm marrying the two contributions is that not so much a romanticization rather, the argument that we shouldn't romanticize pre-colonial Africa, I think is an important intervention in how it then forces us to be honest about our reality now, and also to not to make the certain slips that we are in our important need and want to action what Sobukwe calls the African personality. But to say, for example, and think this is a question to you, that our lives were definitely better. We know how would you? I'd want to ask from you then. When you say pre-colonial Africa was so perfect and not perfect, rather, we lived better, at least than we do now. Female genital mutilation, for example, is a so-called African practice, right? What do you make about certain things that we know existed before, during, and exist today? And things. Can I just finish? Daughter, let me finish. Let me just finish. No, daughter, but I've been. No, it's not a long thing. Remember, I'm balancing also the things happening online. So to say that we know that
other cultures
I
also
see
there are
Lucy's
other things that
Ntsiki.
angithi songibuzile ngiyazi ungibuze nge-female genitalia songifuna
No,
ukungena phakathi guys.
no, it's
So
a question from the floor.
many different cultures, there are different things that happen that don't make sense. Okay.
Are you're breaking, Ntsiki? Sorry, you're breaking. Let's have you answer that question again. Yeah, please try and speak again. Let's hear.
I think that in many different cultures, besides being African, human beings are strange and weird and wonderful creatures. And I think that to just zone in on Africans and female genitalia is not fair, because other cultures, they eat aborted fetuses, and you're not questioning that. Other cultures, they drink people's blood. You don't question that. So I'm like, I'm not comfortable with saying my whole culture is patriarchal because of female genitalia, and I'm just not. I don't think it's exclusive to being African.
No.
The weird things.
No one is saying that. No one is saying that. But anyway, let's go to the questions, because we did ask Satan Africanism Interactive. There's a question in the comments, Noble Daughter, and it simply reads, Ntsiki, are you saying that there was no rape in pre-colonial Africa with certainty? Israelite. That's a question to you.
There's no certainty in anything. This is life. There's good, there's bad, there's darkness, there's light, but there was certainly not rape to this extent, which is why women could walk like that. It's self-evident that women were comfortable in their bodies to be able to walk like that. If the women were in danger and being raped and in trouble with men, I don't think they'd be rolling like that.
Sure. All right. Thank you. Thank you for that. But to finish the point, and this is part of the conversation, right? Not as a attack to either argument, is to zone in, because I think what Ntsik is saying is quite crucial when she's insisting that we should not discount the value of a people being aligned with their culture, because in our culture or experiences of culture, therein lies in the truth about who we are. And part of why we know that so much was taken from us with the colonial encounter was precisely because of the ways that it divorced us from the essence of who we are, right? I accept that. I also accept the argument that we can't because what I think I'm hearing from Azania is that regardless of what existed in Africa or what didn't exist in Africa, the reality is that even these cultures that we hold as sacred were not left unharmed by this colonial encounter, right? And perhaps our problems exclusively, especially as it relates to the ways in which we engage each other on an interpersonal level, can't exclusively and only be laid there. And I'll remove the gender question to bring a bit of another context. When we engage as Ama Africa on the question of capitalism, for example, and expansion, certain Africanists will say, but look, African people also had particular social hierarchies determined by monetary value. So we can't, while we must absolutely fight against the killing capitalism, we must also negotiate that our history of hierarchies based on material possessions did not only happen with the coming of the colonizers. Black people, we had kings, we had serfs, for example. And that then forces us to say, what then becomes our reading of a social order which values certain people over others based on like their relationship with material wealth or not. So where the convergence for me happens between Ntsiki and Azania becomes that, and I think Azania then makes the point of, but there was a decolonial process that happened in Asia that perhaps has not happened in Africa, right? Where they had a cultural revolution. The black person in Africa is still the black right? And the black person in America is still the black. So we were taken from this from Africa and put in ships. Then we taken as the African. We land in the US as the black, and that experience reproduces itself globally wherever we are. We are the black. The Chinese remains the Chinese, remains the Asian. The African has not remained the African. The African becomes the black, and so forth and so on. So I am of the view, and perhaps Ntsiki calls us to order as younger feminists on the ways in which we probably should are not valuing culture. But I don't personally have a attachment to a pre-colonial Africa, because whether or not there was not rape then, it does not change my material reality that when I go outside, I am a target for patriarchal violence. So I'm going to bring in this next question to say, what becomes our political project as African women, young, old, middle-aged alike? What becomes the project of a African feminism? I'll give it to you, Azania, and then Ntsiki, you can come in thereafter. But I want us to have a conversation flowing from, we are not agreed, not agreed, but we are grappling with what it means to be an African, be it an African man or African woman in contemporary struggle, and the role of this culture. And I want us to move to then, what is the African feminist project, the way you imagine it, or what is the gender struggle as we related amongst each other, knowing that we are facing issues of homophobia, issues of patriarchy, and related social ills that continue to contribute to the sickness of our nation, and therefore destabilize this project of building a so-called African nation. So Azania, you can begin us, and then Ntsiki can come in straight after.
Okay, I think I want to point something first, right? This is to say that I've been in spaces with cultural feminists, right? And what I tend to always get out, right? It's to insist that men cannot overcome being oppressive, right? And also in it doing that, it is this tendency of always going back to this pre-colonial Africa, right? But also it is important that we do understand, firstly, that we must reject, right, the ideas that are imposed, right, in conversations, right, especially which is Western ideas, right, of how we uphold ourselves and how we should constitute and organize ourselves in moving forward. But it is also important that in our understanding of the African gender discourse, that Africans must be the ones, therefore, that are agents, right, to consult. For instance, I don't know if you've read or looked at Oyo Humi, who writes from a Yoruba perspective, right, from Nigeria, right, and she speaks beautifully on African feminism, because also at the same time it is important to understand that we are responding to social positions and social historical positions that inform us and position that we find ourselves that we're in today, right? You would also at the same time you would find that in construct or in relations to issues of legitimacy of social facts, right? Because also at the same time, Ntsiki brings it from a biological perspective, right? The menstrual cycle of the woman, you know, and whatever that that it does, you know, eat growing plants and whatsoever. But me, I've always not been interested in the biological, because I do understand that even the biological was what was used to even belittle us as Africans, right? So I'm very much interested in Nazuki in how we respond to the socio-historical, right? And how that socio-historical has positioned us and where we are currently today as Africans, right? And especially speaking precisely to African feminism and Pan-Africanism, right? Because also one, and at the same time, the fact that when also when what do you call that? FGM, female genital mutation. Because seemingly, the point that we're trying to put across that, look, we have this situation, right? Then how do we respond to the situations currently? Because even if you look at female genital mutation, historically, it is it's Muslim, right? Comes from religion, infused in Africa, patriarchal in its notion because it is the male figure who wants their daughter to preserve their virginity, right? And how do you preserve that virginity? Preserve that virginity by going through that FGM process, which later you're going to then get married, right? Which is also at the same time how our womanhood has been defined, specifically us as African women, that this is what our womanhood is, right? The typical examples is like the other one that Ntsik made was in terms of polygamy and all of those things. I mean, we are a different generation, and I'm going to stick to that to say that we create societies, we produce cultures, right? Where was Ntsik today who are poets, right? Also at the same time, how they've been able to use their art to speak to contemporary political issues, which I therefore think then this is exactly the role that which we are trying to play with African feminism. It is the role that which we are trying to play when we are saying therefore that we need to then directly speak to issues of gender and gender discourse within the African context. And we must not even on any given day romanticize it. I don't care if during Kemet times in Egypt there were gays currently in Africa, or we had matriarchal societies. But the fact of the matter is that where we find ourselves currently today, right? And how therefore we move in terms of mobilizing ourselves and organizing ourselves. Because for me, the fact that we always go back to culture, I think it's also what informs Okanye play a huge role in us being able to totally dismantle the system. Because I also think when we are focusing mainly on gender, it seems as though there is no interest, therefore, in addressing the whole systematic issues that which we face as Africans.
Ntsiki to come in there. Thank you for that. Ntsiki? Unmute. Yeah.
Flip. Flip. I've lost my concentration, guys.
Sorry.
I think that for me, it's worrisome. I think it's worrisome that we are Pan-Africanist Congress and speak Black consciousness, but we shy away from culture. I think that's very scary for me. And yeah, I think that's very scary for me, because what does it mean? Who are we then? What is Black consciousness then? Are we going to make it up as we go along? I feel as if other people never have to change their cultures. The Indians never have to change. Nobody else has to change their cultures. It's us who keep making our culture evolve. And I think that we need to recognize that there were things like, say, when we had our period in the past as Africans, women were allowed to take the days off and we don't have menstrual leave right now. But in our culture, we had menstrual leave. So I think that there's a lot of we must own up to being ignorant about our culture. We must own up to being brainwashed by the education system, by urbanization. We must just own up. You know what? We don't know who we are, and who we are has been demonized, and we only hear the worst about ourselves. That's why for me, it's so important, this conversation that has to happen between the elders and the young people, because I don't feel like we as young people know Isintu, and we don't know the value of it. I think that feminism was a response to patriarchy, but patriarchy is a system, and men are responding to that. So the mental brainwash is going to have to happen inside men. It's not our thing. I don't think rape and gender-based violence are women's issues. I think it's a mental thing. It's a conversation that men have to have. That's why I'm like, you're not in my culture, and from the Africans that I know, when I'm at home and with my brothers and stuff, there's no patriarchy. The women are revered. The men are jumping around the women, making sure. So I do think that there's a re-education that needs to happen. I think that we've been brainwashed so much that we don't even actually remember ourselves, and we probably look down on ourselves. And I'm glad that you mentioned that the female genitalia thingy, I don't really Muslim. That's not, he's not African. So Tina Ngesintu, we did not care about our vaginas. That's an influence that comes from outside. So I don't know, I just feel as if we're missing out on a lot because we have shied away from who we are. I found this group actually just last night on Facebook, a traditional healers one, like one of those closed groups. And the stories I was reading there, how people use nature, I was like, wow, like there's a whole world that has been shut off to us, that has been demonized, that could actually empower us, you know? How they make us buy their things, but our things are more evolved. How things like aloe, you know, where they convinced us to use Elizabeth Arden cream, but we had aloe. So I just feel as if we're not, I think we need to just revisit who we are and why we did what, and understand, because even in history, we don't learn our own history. We learn international history, European, American history. We don't learn our own history. So I don't blame us for shying away and saying no in Nanje, but the truth is we actually don't know ourselves.
Sure. Thank you, Ntsiki. I'm going to, I guess, then ask a more like direct question, right? From, you know, the incredible conversation that has been happening, is to ask, to feminist or to not feminist, to put it quite simply. And I think you can make of that what it is. So is feminism, right, can it be Africanized? Is it inherently an African? So because we've agreed that there's gender struggle, we're not disagreed that gender struggle is valid in our contemporary situation as Africa, right? And it is a political project which should be taken quite seriously, and we should heavily invest in it. And Ntsiki then intervened to say, in fact, takes it a step further to say the work of undermining patriarchy lies on the hands, on the shoulders of sons of the soil, right? What is the response that we in the BCPA would feel is suited to advance gender struggle?
You know
right?
what I think?
And I want to keep it like that.
Sorry, I
Yes,
think
daughter.
that even the word feminism, I think, alienates men, you know, and it makes people get defensive. So if we could get into a new system where we are humanists or peopleists, but everybody's equal. For me, it's about gender equality. Like, I don't want to be at war with anyone. I just want to arrive in a room as a woman and be respected equally. That's all the fight is for me. Guti, men and women must have equal footing. So I get scared when we name things because it becomes a tug of war between the two genders.
So Ntsiki, I'll come in there and say, is that not taking us back? Is it not an African? Because were we ever equal? Because if your argument is that we existed in a matriarchy, which is still contested, is the project about equality or equity?
And women balanced. Matriarchy is not the woman on top. Matriarchy is working hand in hand with men.
Okay, because there was a question there on the floor around what do you understand of matriarchy, but I think you have, are you comfortable with that your understanding of matriarchy is not about a woman supremacy of some sort?
Matriarchy is not like that. Women in their essence are not like that.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. I'm captured there with your response. Azania, do you feel the same on the question of feminist Africa, African thing, like, or is there a case to be made that we should engage in a serious gender struggle and politicize that work? Ntsiki says feminism from the onset is problematic, right?
No,
What is your thought?
say that. I said
The
feminism
name,
comes from
no,
the
the
response.
name, yeah,
Yeah,
the
don't
name, the
quote it.
name. I'm
Yeah,
not
it's the
misquoting
name.
you, but it's fine. Sure.
Okay.
As I come in.
Okay. You had a moment where you were breaking, so I just wanted to please repeat the question for me directly from Lomdo Buza.
So the question is, right, should we as Africanist women, right, or in the BCPA, is there a space for feminist discourse in our context? Yeah.
Yes. For me, there is very much, right? And I'll make a typical example for this, just to bring the point home, right? As a PAC woman, a BCPA bloc, an activist, I came to the organization, right, having understood that there were women also that were involved in the liberation discourse. We can count amongst the few, we can count among those women, or Novo Boy. There's many women that we can count that have been involved in the liberation struggle of South Africa. But of course, because of they're women, therefore they've been raised with history, right? And you'd find that in most of the time as women, we do like abafas that we can look up to, right? To say that I know that there was a woman who stood before, right, and who stood for what today I have benefited from. I know that there is a woman, because also I'm trying to necessarily not to us focusing on feminism as just a theory, but also to focus on feminism, looking at the contributions that women and roles that women have played throughout, right? I'm speaking of the 1956 woman. I'm speaking of there's just a lot in the African context. So for me, yes, we do need feminism. Yes, as a PCBA bloc, we do need to have feminism. One, because the spaces that we are in, they are still very much patriarchal. Two, in support of what Ntsik was saying, that I don't need feminism, but men need more feminism. I fully concur with that. So if then we don't have feminist discourse within the movement, how are then men going to, are supposed to understand patriarchy and its effects thereof largely on them, because their actions, therefore, that they are doing it is because of how the patriarchy has affected them as well as Black men. So for me, yes, feminism over and over and over and over again, it is needed in our movement, because also at the same time, when we are speaking of feminism, we must also keep, and Courtney said, the women that have been in solidarity with the LGBTQI plus movement in South Africa, to say that our spaces, our political spaces must therefore must the culture of inclusivity. They must include these different bodies within our liberation discourse, right? So for me, we need to have that. And it is not to say that, because in most movements, you find that feminism is rejected mainly based upon the fact that it is seen as this destabilizing tool. It is seen as a white woman's ideology. It is seen as this foreign thing that comes and destabilizes us. But also at the same time, the question is Marx not Western, is Marx not white, right? So we also need to be very much careful on when we speak directly to feminism. So for me, we do need feminism in the organization, and feminism must prevail. And it therefore starts with women, even in the organization, being fully recognized for the role that they played, be in the revolutionary movement. We want to see in the revolutionary movement, in PAC, posters of Mabelete. We want to see in the PAC, in banners, posters of Novo Boy. We want to see autobiographies from the organization of those women simply because of the role that they've played in the struggle, and of course, in contributing to the women that we are. They might not have necessarily have identified themselves as feminists, but of course, when and we're moving, we are fully recognizing that, look, man, their actions actually were feminist actions, right? Their actions actually were liberating actions that did not specifically speak to one gender, which is the female gender, but they were all for, about, and for the collective, the liberation collective of us. So for me, yes, we do need it, and over again, it must be there in the organization as PCBA, because also at the same time, we have your Black consciousness movement. They are nowhere to be found, you know. Is said about them and their contribution, therefore, to Black consciousness within the South African context, right? And this is not to say that I'm not appreciating, therefore, the role that Steve Biko played within Black consciousness, but also there were, rightfully so, women within that, right? We have other women, such as Omampela Rampet, even though today they are reactionary and otherwise, but also we should be in a position to say that there are these women that have contributed to our politics, and this is where today we find ourselves. How do we then again redefine probably and try to move away from, okay, how do we define their politics? Because also we must be cognizant of the fact that they were responding to a particular time, to a particular discourse in a particular manner, the different ways of organizing because of the time in which they existed, right? So for me, that's the importance of us having feminism within the organization so that women as well are recognized.
So Ntsiki is having some charger issues, so we are going to have to wrap up shortly. Apologies for the darkness. The ANC government has me load shed. So there's three things that I have sort of tried to bring together from this past hour and a half. That, you know, where the importance of a gender justice project as we advance our politics as BCPA, men and women alike, lies in the realm of memory, right? What does it mean to be dismembered, to be deliberately forgotten? And how does that also relate to some of the challenges we're also still facing in the BCPA? So we know that the issues of male chauvinism, toxicity in movement spaces where we organize are not the problems of yesterday. And they did not begin with RMF and FMF. They were there during SNI Blackwash. They were there when Unomvu Boy was fighting there in Apla. And so because of their continuity, whether it is because of how patriarchy essentially has been used in our communities as a tool of the colonizer, which our men have continued to reproduce to serve agendas which are not collectively in our best interest. We must struggle against that, right? At the level of memorializing the legacy of African women and their contributions to struggle, to our liberation, and not just in contemporary struggle, right? Because Ntsiki then brings to the fore the argument around, well, this narrative that the West will have us believe that, you know, African women were these passive beings who just allowed colonial violence to happen, who just allowed, you know, male dominance to happen is quite false. We know of Ombuya Nehanda, we know of Onzinga, and all our, you know, heroes of our movements. And so it is important to borrow and to remind ourselves of the kind of stock which we come from, and also the men themselves. So feminism, African feminism as a site of memory, and I also got African feminism, or a African gender justice project, fascism, if you like, to be a tool of resistance in our armor against colonial white supremacist violence, right, which has fucked all our shit up. Therefore, the language that African women have also been invested and involved in creating becomes a weapon which should be in our arsenal, because the nonsense that is going on in our interpersonal relationships, in structurally and otherwise, must be undermined. You know, our men are raping their partners, are raping strangers, are raping their children, right? We cannot be found to be keeping quiet about those things. Ubutwala is a practice which people hold on to as inherently African and therefore must, you know, and there are similar other examples. So yeah, feminism or African feminism or gender project as a tool in our arsenal. And I'm also getting, you know, a gender project or a feminism as a tool to understand ourselves as Ntsiki, what I'm getting from Ntsiki, to really not undermine the ways in which this colonial violence has caused us to stray so much from ourselves that even the ways in which we make sense of our power, of our role collectively in community making, in family making, in nation building, has been completely distorted at the behest of patriarchal men, and sometimes, not even sometimes, as well as at the behest of a sort of colonial white supremacist reading of who we are as a people. So where I'm at from this conversation is that we really need to, and those three things for me are meat and of themselves. We would never have covered them in 1.5 hours, but they came out quite strong. And I think we have made the case through your stunning interventions for a continuation of this. So in closing, because we are denied time, I'm going to ask daughters to take 5 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes, to just give your closing comments and remarks on this question of Africanism and feminism in Azanian struggle. I don't know who wants to start between the two of you. Go for it. Closing remarks.
Closing remarks, right?
Yeah, closing remarks on this question of Africanism and feminism, considering the conversations we've had. Just closing remarks. What do you want to leave Ama Africa with from this conversation? Yeah.
Okay, for me, from onset, right, it is very important for us to acknowledge and agree with some of the important ideas, right, of feminism. There are also different ideologies of the feminist discourse that purely are faultless, and they're just that, right? So number one, I want us to keep in cognizance that some masculinities and feminine behavior are not simply determined solely by biology. However, it's by socialization. Number two, it is that women have suffered in several ways from different kinds of oppression and mistreatment throughout the course of history, as long as we shall remember. And this oppression is mostly, it is dehumanizing. And thirdly, it is that males often at times have unjust advantage over females, right? Which is the power that they possess, right? The beauty standards and objectification tend to be damaging to the female, to our self-image, to our self-esteem, right? And lastly, I just want to make this note that patriarchy is not only damaging to the female body, but patriarchy is damaging as well to the male body. So it is important that for us as Africans, we come together, right, collectively so, in trying to therefore address these issues that are facing us as a collective. But also in so doing, we must not in any day or in any manner try to suppress the gender discourse in our politics. We must never on any given day try to silence the voice of women within our spaces simply because we are not comfortable enough currently to discuss feminism. We are not comfortable enough to discuss our homophobic agendas. We are not even comfortable enough to discuss imbajo yamadoda within our organizations. So immediately when we have those conversations, therefore, I do believe that, even if we're saying that our current feminism is Western, but I do believe that we would then have a feminism that we imagine as Africans, because I certainly think that we are capable of building things for ourselves, of reimagining Africa in the manner in which we imagine it, and to arrive to the utopian society and the Azania that we tomorrow want as well.
Okay, thank you, Madam Moderator, for a great job. Thank you, Azania, for a great job. It's been so awesome hanging out with you guys. I think for me, we have to start at men crying. It's a time for men to cry, you know, and to release a lot of emotion. And they've grown up not being allowed to cry, and there's a lot of pent up emotion that we must acknowledge. I think that it's important that we get to a place where men and women are speaking. Like we have to find our halfway meeting ground, because I've learned, even with myself, you know, I don't respond to someone shouting at me. Like with my Twitter account, I don't respond when people are screaming at me and, you did it like this. But when somebody is gentle about it and explains to me how it comes, like how I'm hurting them, then I can understand it. So I think for as long as we're just seeming like we're screaming, we're not going to get any communication done between the two genders. My other fear with feminism is that it divides us as women, because we've got this cool group, the intellectuals who have read more bell hooks, you know, and then they are the cool group, people who are the police of women now. So that's also so for me, I think the most important thing is for men and women to get to a point where we start conversing and women start expressing how much men are hurting us. Because I think that's where the breakdown in communication is happening. It's in our communication as Black men and Black women. But I do think that we are going to have to give men a space. These people are broken inside. All right, that's the end of the session.
Thank you. I just want to, in closing for me, I think it would be a total disservice not to mention that I think it was such a brilliant coming together of Azania and Ntsiki, because what you mean to us, daughters, I'm a big fan of giving people flowers while they're still alive. They are whole worlds which you have allowed us to access through your feminism. It is not always easy being a public entity, but this is brilliant, and I want to thank you as a fellow Azanian woman for the ways in which you have brought conversations that are uncharted waters to the floor, for the ways in which you continue to insist on pushing the envelope. And even just from this conversation alone, where we departed, where we met, where we connected, there's so much. And I'm asking now, and I'm being naughty, but definitely, absolutely think a part 2 of this would really be warranted. Honestly, you are fierce and dedicated Africanist woman. This has been such a pleasure, and I'm not going to forget to ask you, Africa, to like the Africanist page, like the Africanist on Twitter, yeah. And the last thing, please make sure you share this conversation. It was juicy and meaty across the social networks. Sister Ntsiki, Sister Azania, this has been
Can you
great.
challenge Ntsiki, guys? Challenge Ntsiki, can you please do a biography on your mother, please?
Wait.
Can you please do a biography on Belete?
Okay.
I think Ntsik is lost. Good night, African.
I will.
Isn't it?
Please.
I'm
I will.
stop the live.